Hi everyone, my name is John. Welcome back to my channel. This is one more video in an attempt to try to catch up with the books I've read and making videos about those books. This is a book I've had on my bookshelf for a long time. Maybe since I was in college. I guess there's a small chance I might have bought this in high school. Very small chance. This is Barbara Kingsolver's The Poisonwood Bible, with one of those stickers that sort of festoons the cover that it's not really a sticker, I guess, it's on there. So it's an Oprah's Book Club edition. So like I said, this has been in my library for a long time, and I thought I would eventually pick it up and read it. And I did earlier this summer. And for a couple of reasons. One is I think this is the 25th anniversary of the publication of the novel. And secondly, someone whose channel I know and love, Kim, over at Middle of the Book March, who reads a lot more contemporary fiction than I do, recently mentioned in a video, maybe a couple of months ago, set off my whole interest again in reading it, and she said she really loved it. So I will link Kim's channel below in case you don't know about her and you also have an interest in contemporary fiction. So I want to talk a little bit about the novel first. I think it's really rich with possibilities, what Barbara Kingsolver is trying to do here. So you have this patriarch, the head of the family. His name is Nathan Price. He is an American evangelical preacher and missionary, and he arrives in the Congo with his wife and his 4 children. This is back when the Congo was the Belgian Congo, late 50s, 1959 to be specific, I think. They are used to, having come from the United States, the endless sort of litany of American amenities, in post-World War II United States. They had their flushing toilets and their ice cream cones and their sneakers, and they were very used to a nice life, nice middle-class American life. But those things in the Congo have been replaced with crushing heat, with humidity, with an endless parade of poisonous animals, and the constant threat of diseases like malaria and African sleeping sickness. And in the face of so much hardship, Nathan's wife, who is named Orleana, she wants to reverse course, and she wants to go back home to Bethlehem, Georgia. But Nathan sees that as an abandonment of his duty toward God and towards the Congolese people, which he sees as savages, or little better than savages, really. And he's determined to stay on for as long as he possibly can, maybe for the rest of his life. Just when matters start to look really intractable, the Congo, and this is, the Price family appears to be fictional, but this is set against, obviously, a very real historical set of events, and I'll just talk a little bit about the historical events, namely the revolution that took place in the Congo in the very early 60s. The Congo erupts in a lot of violent riots in its major cities, and in doing so, it sort of experiences the birth pangs of what is going to become the Democratic Republic of the Congo, and it is going to elect its first democratically elected leader, whose name is, of course, Patrice Lumumba. The CIA didn't like Lumumba very much, mostly because of his past involvement in socialist, leftist, and Pan-Africanist politics, so it decided to insert itself in Congolese politics, as it is done in the politics of dozens of countries all across the world, And this eventually brings the absolute monster Mobutu to power. We don't see Mobutu in the novel. He comes after the shift has uh, focused back to the United States in the novel. But in the early days of the revolution, resources, of course, grow scarce, and the Price family has to find even more inventive ways to live and to leave if they want to. And the action comes to a head when a tragic event, I won't say what it is, but it is full of biblical symbolism and relevance. It involves a snake, causes Orleana to leave the Congo and go back home to Georgia for good. Kingsolver's writing is really evocative, especially when her subject is the land, for which she has a clear passion. And actually, Barbara Kingsolver herself spent a couple of years in the Congo as a small child. The best writing is in the first part of the book, where the family gradually starts to realize the degree to which they are all in over their heads, and how, because of Nathan Price's obstinacy, they will never be able to leave, until, of course, they finally do. Kingsolver writes in short chapters narrated by each of the 5 women: Orleana, Nathan's wife, and his 4 daughters, who are named Ada, Leah, Ruth May, and Rachel. The chapters alternate, allowing for each of the 5 voices to sort of come together and present themselves individually, but also to sing polyphonically together. And each of the 5 does really retain a distinct outlook and personality through all the family's tribulations. We learn, for example, that Ada, who is hemiplegic and nonverbal from birth, is, through her own chapters, we hear her in her own voice, of course, is easily the most witty, intelligent, creative of the bunch, despite being nonverbal. Leah is idealistic and initially looks up to her father and his mission, but eventually falls away from his faith, and in adulthood gains a political consciousness, which is formed by her earlier childhood experiences. Rachel is the ditzy, materialistic, shallow, silly one who changes not very much at all, even into adulthood. I guess she kind of represents the nihilistic reaction to the events of her childhood. The second part of the book, at least for me, is less effective, consisting of intermittent outlooks at the characters and their adult lives after they come back to the United States. Ada somehow regains her speech after being nonverbal. I don't know how that happened. It's one of the questions that I think is left unanswered in the book. It might have been addressed somewhere, but I don't remember reading about it. She regains her speech. After coming back to the United States, she decides to enroll in Emory University, and after graduating from Emory, to enroll in medical school, where she becomes a well-known virologist, and she ends up specializing in the diseases that she knew and had to live around growing up. So basically like a tropical disease epidemiologist or a virologist. She represents the very clinical, literally clinical, scientific, analytical way of reacting towards her childhood. Leah marries a Congolese friend who worked for the Congo's independence movement and eventually spends time in jail because of the work he does against the Mobutu regime. Again, Leah is the one who had a sort of raise in political consciousness after she comes back. And so she is the one who represents a kind of active political engagement in trying to change the world and trying to become aware of the world. Rachel stays in Africa. She buys a hotel, but certainly remains the same sort of flat character unengaged, silly, shallow, materialistic, um, juvenile. Over time, like I said, even well into adulthood, she just doesn't really do take well to taking things seriously. But as the years wear on in the second part of the novel, the personalities which were drawn subtly to begin with in the first parts become a bit more eccentric. They become a little more exaggerated. Um, and unfortunately, it may have been to make a series of ideological or political points on the part of Barbara Kingsolver. And I'll get to that in a second. Ada, whose childhood narration used to be replete with literary references and wordplay earlier in the novel, turns into a reserved, cool scientist in her attempt to understand the world around her. The later chapters are narrated by her. They lack any wordplay. They lack any creativity. It's just sort of a flat narrative of someone who is interested in science but doesn't have any playfulness with words anymore. She used to love palindromes and would write sentences forwards and backwards. That doesn't happen in any of the later chapters. Um, and I think the book may have benefited, maybe, from adding a sixth voice, which would have been Nathan's voice. I assumed from the absence of Nathan's voice that maybe Kingsolver was trying to make a bit of a point and tell the novel from only the point of view of 5 women, and to have it told only through the point of view of women. But in an interview I read, or maybe listened to, she said she left out Nathan's perspective because she thought no one would want to hear the narration of someone who was so unlikable. And I thought that was a really, really bizarre comment to make. You can make him unlikable, and you can also make us empathize with him, if that's really what you want us to do. There is one episode in the book where we hear about why Nathan might be the way he is, and it has something to do with the time that he served in World War II. And I think does it mention the Bhutan Death March? That he spent time in some really, really, really horrific circumstances in World War II in the part of a soldier. And there's hints that it might have given him PTSD or complex PTSD or something like that. But her efforts to empathize with him or draw him as little more than a tyrant or a despot or a patriarch who just likes to wield his power over his family are few and far between. I think he's set up to be basically a pretty unsympathetic character. And he is horrible, so I'm okay with that. The biggest sin that visits itself on Kingsolver's prose is its, and I don't mean to say prose style, but I mean just the message, is its ham-handedness. The action is clearly meant to throw doubt on the pretensions of colonialism, which I think is an admirable goal. I'm not against that in any way. But the moral world she casts is pretty black and white, and she leaves not a lot of room for shades of gray. And ironically, irony of ironies, she comes across as a little bit screechy and preachy. I can forgive a lot of faults in fiction, but letting the message carry away the book makes it look like the author no longer is in control of the book and its message, and worse yet, makes it look like a political screed instead of a novel. So I was talking about Kim earlier. Her channel is Middle of the Book March. She has mentioned a few times in recent videos, Kingsolver's most recent novel, which is Demon Copperhead, which has gotten a lot of talk. What won the Pulitzer Prize, I think? And Kim has mentioned that it has a similarly preachy tone, this time about the epidemic of the rural opioid crisis in the United States. Also, a big problem. But if it tends to be preachy, if it tends to lecture you instead of tell you a story about human beings, that is for me a problem. Unless maybe you're writing nonfiction, but this is obviously a novel, and so is Demon Copperhead. Until she said that, until Kim said that about Demon Copperhead, I hadn't been able to really articulate what didn't quite sit right with me about the book. But that's it. It's preachy. It's you were supposed to see Orleana and the four daughters, for the most part, as the good, and Nathan, for the most part, as the bad. Not because he's the man, but there are good men in the novel as well. But because he is thinks that he is evangelizing to people whose souls need to be saved because they're backwards and uncivilized and barbarians. It just has a very, very narrow view of the world because of the circumstances in which he's been raised, I guess. And knowing that she's continued to do this with novels, Kingsolver, I mean, for at least another 25 years, makes me less eager to read more fiction by her. But in the end, I enjoyed this book quite a bit and would recommend it to others even despite the rating that I gave it on Goodreads. If there was such a thing on Goodreads, I would probably give this 3.5 stars, but I ended up rounding it down to 3 for the reasons I've listed, the criticisms I've listed. The questions that it brings up, though, from colonialism and its legacy, to how the private is always political, to how we can assimilate new knowledge but always do so within our pre-existing mental schema, and especially that old Faulknerian theme of how the past constantly revisits itself on the present and how we are complicit in the ways that happens. All of those are of perennial relevance for anyone trying to find their voice in a complex world like the four daughters are here. For all of its faults, Kingsolver's novel does a really good job at telling a story that raises awareness of these issues and how 5 very, very different women struggled with them. So, 3 stars on Goodreads, but if it sounds interesting, I nevertheless recommend it. The Poisonwood Bible by Barbara Kingsolver. And I will see you anon.